Hello, grade 12. This is chapter 7, section 4, and we're continuing the French Revolution and Napoleon's empire. Now, we discussed Napoleon's background and how did he reach into creating the empire and how did he reach into his rule. Now, after he started ruling as an emperor, Napoleon feared that his empire would collapse after his death. This is because he had no heir. So what happened is that he formed an alliance with Austria, and then he married Marie-Louise from the Austrian royal family. He then had a son whom he called Napoleon II. Now, in this lesson, we're going to discuss some of the greatest mistakes that Napoleon made, which resulted in the end of his empire or the end of his ruling time. Now, Napoleon desperately wanted to crush Great Britain. Remember, France and Britain are old enemies. So what he did was, the first costly mistake was setting up a blockade, which he called the continental system. This continental system blocked all European trade with England. So he stopped all the European trade with England. What happened is smugglers and other countries ignored this blockade. And Britain also imposed a blockade on France. So some ships were avoiding France and some ships were avoiding Britain. This divided the world into two different sides and two different powers. What happened is that a war started. The War of 1812 began over this issue of the blockade. So Napoleon's first costly mistake was the blockade that he set up, which he called the continental system. Why is it a costly mistake? Because it divided the countries and allies into two different sides. Two, because France made its own blockade on Britain. And three, because this initiated a war between the French and the anti-French countries. Now, Napoleon also went to war with Portugal in order to force it to accept the continental system. The French troops invaded Spain on their way to Portugal. So it wasn't enough to force Portugal, but he also invaded Spain. When Spain protested, Napoleon removed the king and placed his own brother in power. Now, the Spanish nationalism grew stronger because many of the people feared that the chaos that happened in France would happen in Spain again. The Spanish used guerrilla warfare to drag France into a bloody conflict, which caused Napoleon the loss of 3,000 of his troops. So the second costly mistake was the Peninsula War, which is the war that Napoleon had with Portugal. Why? Because he tried to invade Spain and he tried to force Portugal into the continental system, and the Spanish and Portuguese did not agree, and in this conflict, Napoleon lost a lot of his troops. Now, the third costly mistake was invading Russia. Alexander I of Russia, the Tsar of Russia, refused to stop selling grains to Great Britain as part of the continental blockade. So Napoleon decided to invade Russia. In June 1812, Napoleon's army, which was at that time made up of 420,000 soldiers or troops, invaded Russia. Alexander I countered back with a scorched earth policy. This policy was that he burned Moscow to the ground. Alexander actually burned his country, his city. He burned Moscow to the ground in order to stop Napoleon's army from getting any food or resources. Napoleon and his troops remained in Moscow until October, and then he tried to go back to France. While going back to France, the Russian troops attacked Napoleon from behind and trapped his troops into the strong, fierce Russian winter. Napoleon's troops did not have any food, supplies, and of course, they could not stand the harsh Russian winter, so they starved and froze. And out of the 420,000 troops that actually invaded Russia, only 10,000 survived. Now, after these three mistakes, Napoleon was weakened, or actually France was weakened. Now Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden all allied together against Napoleon. Napoleon would not give up. He raised a new army, but this new army was quickly formed in less than a year, and because of this, most of the soldiers were inexperienced. Napoleon, as a result of this, accepted the surrender, and he accepted when he accepted this surrender, he had to accept some terms. These terms included that he was going to get exiled to a small island known as Elba. An exile means it's a kick out of the country. So he has to leave France, and he will not come back again. Now, Louis the 16th became the king of France. He was very unpopular, and he was greatly disliked because of the many troubles that the French people faced with Louis and Marie during the French Revolution. And they feared that he would undo the revolution. When Napoleon heard of this chaos and crisis between the new ruler, and the people, he escaped from Elba and returned to Paris to reclaim the throne. Surprisingly, massive crowds of French people celebrated the return of Napoleon. When the European enemies, or the European countries, heard of Napoleon's return, they declared war. They were not going to wait for Napoleon to forge another army and start another war against them. So on June 18th, 1815, Napoleon, to counter back, attacked Britain at Waterloo in Belgium. Again, because Napoleon had young, inexperienced troops, they were devastatedly and severely crushed by the Prussian and the British troops. During the Battle of Waterloo, it lasted for 2 days, and then Napoleon had to surrender. After this battle, Napoleon was sure that he could not raise a strong army or win battles like before. He was sent into permanent exile into St. Helena, where he remained until his death in 1821. Now, even though Napoleon was not the best of the leaders, but he left a legacy. Why? Napoleon was a brilliant administrator and a military genius. Even though he lost the last 2 years from the time he got exiled, or from the time of his downfall, he lost all the battles. But before that, from the time he was assigned as a soldier or a commander in the French army, until he decided to make his 3 costly fatal mistakes, Napoleon never lost a battle. He started the idea of nationalism, which means that the people should be united not by borders or not by religion, but by whatever that is common between them, that there has to be no boundaries between the people. He came up with the idea, and then nationalism started to spread throughout Europe and in the New World. After the French Revolution, there was chaos in terms of government, in terms of taxes, in terms of education, in terms of any economic or financial establishment. Napoleon re-established order. He created organized systems that lasted far more after the revolution. This is the end of chapter 7, section 4. Please go back, write down the dates if there are any, or the battles, or the names. Make sure you write clear notes and study well. And if you have any questions, please let me know.